Let's talk about people with a grandiose sense of self. And to explore this, it's such a fascinating subject. I'm going to utilize a metaphor of, say, for instance, the stock market, but specifically crypto. Bitcoin. Let's look at Bitcoin, for instance. Maybe it's not the absolute best example, but in the universe of crypto, there are coins out there that are far more hype than anything else. And that means that whatever noise there is around them or whatever bubble has been created around them is fragile, likely to burst, and then cripple to absolutely nothing. And then, of course, like go back and, back and forth and everything. What's interesting about people with a grandiose sense of self is that it's not that there's entirely nothing there in terms of a sense of self, but a far majority of it is really just hype. That's all that it is. Now, see, the fascinating thing about people with a grandiose sense of self is that they see themselves as more than human, as superior to everybody else, even though they are completely not. But the issue is that the overinflated part of it is based on the survival dynamic from childhood. They didn't have a healthy childhood. If you come out of childhood as an adult with a grandiose sense of self, you did not have a healthy childhood. Something along the lines got severely fucked up, and likely a bunch of defense mechanisms, maybe even maladaptive defense mechanisms, were what led you to be grandiose. And again, I don't like to use labels, but I will just throw out the term narcissism because this is definitely seen with narcissists. They have this superior, this grandiose sense of self, this sense of entitlement to everything and to everyone's lives. Usually they don't give a flying fuck about you, and that's the reality of it. But let me just say that the fascinating contrast between a grandiose sense of self and the actuality of every single human is that there is not a single person on the face of this planet that is any more or less human than anybody else. There are people in pop culture that like to claim themselves as God. Yeah, they're probably psychotic, referring to a severe sense of out of touchness with reality. Because nobody on the face of this planet is more than human. But people with a grandiose sense of self, they tend to see themselves as more than human. They tend to see themselves as perfect. But the fascinating thing is that this entire construct of a grandiose sense of self is pretty much in and of itself a defensive construct against a fuck ton of pain. Like, there's probably a shit ton of shame foundationally. There's probably a shit ton of guilt foundationally. So they kind of essentially created this hype of a bubble for themselves to defend against the pain of, it goes beyond the almost nothingness that is there at the core of their personality, but also to avoid the pain of shame. People with a grandiose sense of self tend to be exceedingly shame-based. And when I say that, what I'm referring to is that they see themselves as shame. It's not just that whatever it is that they've done has been shameful, but it's that they themselves are shame. And to have that be who you are as a person for somebody like that is exceedingly painful. Now, let me make this very clear. Nobody is shame. I really don't even like to consider shame as really like a narrative of the human consciousness. And when I say that, what I'm referring to is that as a society in general, we live in a very shame-based way. But it's more so because people lack healthy boundaries and they just project their shame onto other people. But you can see that this is actually what happens for a lot of people during their childhood development, from infancy to adolescence. They are raised by somebody who projects a fuck ton of shame onto them because that person lacked and probably still lacks healthy boundaries. And so the shame in and of itself is a learned personality trait, a characteristic, not just a matter of, oh, you should be ashamed of that. You should be somebody other than the shame that you are, is really the real defining message. So then, in and of itself, the personality is basically created to defend against the pain of the shame, because the person sees themselves as shame. It's not just shame based. I mean, it basically makes itself out. It equates itself to being shame based. But imagine somebody thinks that they, as a person, are shame. That is the construct. And so then the bubble, the hype of being more than a person, being this godlike prophet, messiah, chosen one, entity, identity, is like a defense mechanism against the pain. You create this character to defend against the pain of the underlying structure. So now that I've explored a lot of that, if somebody has a grandiose sense of self, they are likely terrified to look at themselves. Because one, they're going to see very little of anything in terms of personality. People like those that are labeled as narcissists, they have a severe lacking of development in ego state. And what that means is that regularly, like on a consistent daily basis, they don't know who the fuck they are. That's fucking painful. So they create all of this hype, all of this hot air, all of this noise to compensate for that. And of course, they choose people in life that will reinforce that, because they need to have that reinforced, because they didn't have healthy mirroring when they were younger. You know, when a parent mirrors you, it basically shows you that you're fucking real and you exist. People that are labeled as narcissists did not get that. That's just the way that it is. That's why their ego state development was so fucking scarce. Rather than this wholesome picture of an ego state with identity, security, and all these necessary ingredients, they just got this little thing here that doesn't tell them a whole lot about themselves. And quite honestly, it's just it's like flashing back and forth. It's very unstable. And so what do? They go out there and they create identity based on other people. And also, they're so scared to look at themselves because there's almost nothing there, that they avoid it altogether, and they create this bubble of hype. Now, if the bubble of hype pops, man, shit gets scary. But other than that, I'm not really interested in exploring that in and of itself. The fascinating thing about people with a grandiose sense of self is that they're terrified of the reality. They're terrified of reality. They don't live inside of reality. They live inside of psychosis. They are regularly psychotic, out of touch with the reality of who they are, which is just human. Which, by the way, there's nothing wrong with that. We're all just human. But that scares the shit out of them, because otherwise there is close to nothing there. And that's a terrifying thing to look at. Imagine you wake up on a daily basis not knowing who the fuck you are. And when I say that, what I mean is that people that have a healthy identity, a healthy sense of self, either because they did the work later on in adulthood or they had a healthy childhood, they regularly, on a consistent daily basis, know who they are. They have something to reference. People that have a grandiose sense of self, which in and of itself is basically a defense mechanism against the pain over time, it's a bubble. It's just hype. So when that bubble pops like crypto and it goes from $100,000 all the way back down to $25,000, shit gets scary. Because then you don't know what you're fucking doing, and you don't know who you are, you don't know where to go. You're basing a lot of your identity off of people around you. You tie your sense of self to people because there's nearly nothing inside. But let's talk about being scared of approaching yourself if you have a grandiose sense of self. People labeled as, and again, I do not like labels. I like to look at characteristics and defense mechanisms. The defense mechanism is the grandiose sense of self. And the reason the defense mechanism is there is to defend against the pain of the near nothingness that is within any given individual that has a grandiose sense of self. That is very important to understand. But like, you could either continue living your entire life believing that you have this grandiose sense of self and that you are superior to like everybody else on the face of this planet, and things will get far unhealthier. That's just the way that it is. Or you can approach yourself, and I'm not saying that this is easy. No. When somebody with a grandiose sense of self has their identity interrupted by something, whether it's self-inflicted or externally inflicted, oh my God, talk about a shitstorm of a person. Well, imagine like you look at yourself and you don't see anything. It's kind of scary now. Imagine if you were to like be by yourself and then it's like all of a sudden you forgot who you are. It's a scary experience. Now, I'm not saying to do any of this stuff on your own. I would actually definitely argue to seek help from a licensed professional, one that's really fucking good at what they do, because, you know, not all of them actually know how to guide people down this path. But the contrast between the grandiose sense of self and the fact that you are just a fucking human being. And by the way, when I say that you're just a human being, I'm not here to devalue anybody. The reality of everyone is that they are just a human being. Like, that's it. Like, I'm just a dude. I'm just a human. You're just a dude or a woman. You're just a human. That's all that there is to. I'm not here devaluing anybody, saying that, you know, you're bad. No, I'm not saying any of that stuff. What I'm saying is that the reality of every single human is that they're just a human. There are many wonderful characteristics of being human, but you're still just a human. You may, through a grandiose observation, suggest that you are a god. Not true. Out of touch with reality. A messiah, a prophet. Where's your fucking proof? It's usually somewhere within psychosis. If you see yourself in a grandiose way, you are out of touch with reality. Reality is that you are just human. No more or less than anybody else on the face of this planet. So if you do see yourself in a grandiose way, understand that you are out of touch with reality, because the reality is that you are no better or worse than anybody else. But that in and of itself, because that was the entire identity construct to defend against the pain, is really fucking difficult for a lot of people to explore. And so understanding that the path forward is to look at yourself as you can, in a balanced way. You know, that's the journey. It's more so a matter of taking yourself off the pedestal, stopping idolizing yourself. You're just a human. And I mean, like, you know, I've got compassion for people that are going through different things, you know, mentally and emotionally. But the reality is, you are just you. I don't care who you are. I don't care what you think about yourself. I don't care what you have made other people do for your identity through manipulative tactics. You are just a human being. That's it. You might be obsessed with your own sense of distorted self-importance. You're just a human being.